Thank you. I'm sorry I have to read in English, but this time I do not speak freely but read because we have the copy of my talk. And if I read, you can follow it. If I speak, you cannot follow it. So I'm going to read my paper. Starting with a quotation from Genesis 3. The Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And the Lord said to Cain, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." And Cain did not master it. This story is the first model of free moral choice. Eve was also facing a choice to bite in the fruit picked from the tree of knowledge or reject it. Yet she chose without being able to tell good from evil. She could tell only the permitted from the forbidden. Choosing between the forbidden and the permitted is not a free choice, since one chooses the permitted for fear of sanction and the forbidden in a gesture of curiosity or revolt. But neither of the choices is based on the knowledge of good and evil. One acts as an innocent child. As Kierkegaard said, innocence is ignorance. But Cain knew good from evil. He could have chosen the good, yet he succumbed to evil. Choosing the good would have been a free choice, yet Cain, as God warned him, succumbed rather to the desire of sinning. He did not make use of the opportunity to be the first man choosing freely. In fact, in the Bible, no man chose before Noah freely. Taking a gross leap above several thousand years to philosophy of Kant, one faces a very similar conceptions, supported at this time by philosophical arguments. In his second critique, Kant speaks of free will and not free choice. Free will is a transcendental idea, not an empirical category. To put it bluntly, will as an empirical human capacity does not exist. We will this or that is, we set ourselves certain goals, choose means to achieve them, and set out to achieve them. One can say that X has a weak will because he rather dreams about reaching some goal, but does not do anything to do it. And the other has a strong will because he is like a bulldog, pushes all possible means in direction of achieving his goal. The substitution of freedom of will, a transcendental idea, to free choice as an empirical concept is not problematic because of the metaphysical connotation of the former alone, but also because transcendental will does not presuppose a choice at all. To continue still with Kant, free will is the manifestation of transcendental freedom. Man's freedom is just obedience to the moral law, to transcendental freedom. There is no moral choice at all. Let me return to the Genesis story. God warns also Cain that he has the capacity to do the right thing and not succumb to sin. But he still puts Cain before a choice, a free choice. Cain should do the right thing because it is right to avoid sin, not for reasons of obedience, but because it is a right. The discussion about freedom of the will free choice went on for centuries, I may say for millions of years, 1 million. So anyway, for centuries. Young Augustinus, wrote a book in support of free choice, only to revise it later. Luther wrote a book about the slavery of the will. Leibniz combined the two conceptions successfully. The seemingly insoluble problem was, briefly, that since everything has a cause, will or choice need also have a cause. And if they have a cause, they cannot be free, because they are determined. Freedom equals acting as nihilo, and only God can be causa sui, and only he can create ex nihilo. The springing point was mostly that cause has been identified with causa efficiens. Everything that exists has a cause, means then that in our case, will or choice should be determined by something. For example, some thoughts, desires, needs, instincts, and so on. Here, however, an old problem emerges. Everything determined by causa efficiens alone is contingent. So said Aristotle, and it would be very difficult to contradict him. Thus, if choice or will is determined by causa efficiens alone, all choices are contingent. Kant solved this problem with philosophical success. There is one causa efficiens that is absolute, and therefore it necessitates. This is transcendental freedom. It cannot be open to choice, since it is absolute, necessary, imperative, the opposite of all contingencies. Kant's solution is very elegant philosophically, yet it presupposes the strict metaphysical contrast of two worlds, the empirical world of nature, to which categories apply, and the noumenal world of freedom, to which the ideas of reason apply. In a post-metaphysical philosophical universe, this answer does not hold. One has to look for alternatives. I mean, for a post-metaphysical understanding of the world, we cannot accept the division of the world into an empirical and a transcendental one. Before entering a discussion about the possible alternatives, philosophical solution, let me address the issue of a merely empirical choice without touching the strictly problem of freedom. So a merely empirical choice, I will speak about first about merely empirical choices. Thinking, cogitare, is an empirical concept. Thinking exists. We humans are constantly thinking, even in our dreams, where our unconscious mind does the work of thinking. The concept of thinking encompasses several different mental activities, such as speaking, understanding, perceiving, imagining, remembering, recognizing, intuiting, demonstrating, arguing, discussing, planning, and surely also choosing. In this sense, Descartes' dictum, cogito ergo sum, is undoubtedly true. A brain-dead being, that is a former person who lost all the above-mentioned mental abilities, is not a human person, just a living being, as the Americans say, a vegetable. Philosophers normally have separate names for all mental abilities, activities in store. Among them also several rational capacities. For example, logos, nous, episteme, sophia, phronesis, noesis, gnosis, to mention only the Greek ones, whereas liberum, arbitrium, ratio, intellectus, intuitio are some Latin varieties of the same. Human beings, namely, choose. Some animals and certain domestic animals also choose. I will now speak only about human choices. First, I discuss choices in general, irrespective of their possible ethical relevance, and only afterwards about moral choices. There is a difference between preference and choices, although preferences are also choices. The difference is temporal. In case of a preference, I can choose today A and tomorrow B, one does not exclude the other. Today I walk, while tomorrow I will take a bus. Speaking of preferences, one can encounter choices motivated just by efficient causes. For example, a baby prefers food A because it tastes so and well and smells well. This kind of preference seems entirely contingent, standing in no relation to autonomy or heteronomy. But if a kind of preference becomes continuous, it will also include a kind of final cause, because the preference involves already pragmatic memory. The child does not anymore prefer a food for its taste, but will have a taste for this food, will wish to have the same kind of food. Repetition, the desire for repetition of a past good feeling of an end appears. It is an end and appears as an end whenever pragmatic memory is at play. As in all cases of habitual actions, the distinction between efficient and final cause is normally absent, not always, but generally. One brushes one's teeth every morning, one repeats an act inscribed on memory, pragmatic memory. It is also difficult to distinguish, in these cases, heteronomy and autonomy. I got to practice brushing my teeth every morning without even noticing it. If someone asks me why I do it, I try to give an answer, such as, my mother told me so, or for the health of my teeth's sake. The first answer suggests an efficient cause and an external cause, the second a final cause or a preference. What is important is that habitual choices, repeated preferences, are repetitions, and repetitions on their part presuppose previous knowledge or previous experience, that is pragmatic memory. Every choice, even the simplest one, presupposes memory at work. Although most of our choices are everyday habitual choices or preferences, if the question of significance is put on the agenda, we do not have this kind of choices in our mind. Then we cannot avoid facing the issue of autonomy or heteronomy. Usually, we are not interested whether taking one dress for an evening party and not another one is an act of autonomy or heteronomy, although we can ponder whether the choice is motivated by the desire to please or by personal taste. One can choose ends and means by intuition, by sudden illumination, just as well by conscious deliberation. But even if an end appears in my mind in a flash, and I act spontaneously, I have to act consciously, using intuition itself as a road sign. The end goal of the choice is in the future. Even if we are sure to have chosen the right, the desired good, the required, the promising thing, and we do not know whether we have chosen the proper means to reach it. We take a double risk. All kinds of choices involve risks and, as a result, responsibility. How significant the risk is, how serious is our responsibility, depends both on the kind of the choice and the circumstances independent of the choice. I mention only on the sideline that mental health requires to be able to sense the weight, the significance or non-significance of a choice, as also the ability to make decisions. None should be like the S of Buddhism. The typical metaphor of significant choices is the crossroad of 2, 3, or 4 avenues. One has to choose one avenue of them in order to arrive to one's destination. There are no road signs, one has no map, one lacks information. Yet one cannot stand forever on the crossroad if for no other reason, because one has not enough food or water to survive on a crossroad for long. One can ruminate rationally. But what should I choose rationally? Making judgment about the quality of the roads, the conditions of the roads, or else. One can also listen to one's unconscious, the internal yes or no feeling, to a kind of instinct substitute. One can also bet, taking a chance by matchsticks or pieces of paper in a hat, that fate or luck should decide that the choice of proper road is accidental. But is it? Is it really accidental? It is purely accidental whether one starts to ruminate or bet or rely on her instincts. Babies are not standing on a crossroad. Everyone standing on a crossroad has already a story, a history. She has memories about earlier choices, the results of earlier choices. She has an autobiographical memory. Flashes of earlier experiences come back, images reappear. Every person has some kind of knowledge of oneself, a kind of subjective identity. The person standing at the crossroad stands there also as a bunch of autobiographical memory. No two persons have the same subjective identity, not even identical twins do. That is, persons on the metaphorical crossroad will choose also on the ground of their character, formed and shaped by the events, and especially by earlier choices, preserved in their autobiographical memory. In this sense, every choice at an imaginary crossroad implies autonomy, self-determination as the final touch of a character shaped by subjective identity, even it is never entirely autonomous. Yet why it is not? Autobiographical memory that constitutes our subjective identity, that puts its stamp on all our subsequent choices, is shaped also by the images of the world, experiences with the world, norms and values of the world, encounters with people, with stories of the world, with a shared cultural memory. If one stands before the metaphorical crossroad, one stands there with a character shaped by one's world. One recalls not just personal experiences and previous choices, but also decisions of one's ancestors, probably of one hero also, in a similar situation, fairy tales, warnings of one's mother, experiences of one friend, and so on. If we leave the abstract image of the crossroad metaphor behind and turn to real life situations of significant choices, we will have better insight into the importance and the influence of persons' experiences and cultural memory. One has to choose between two boys to form a constant relationship, or the two different countries where to emigrate, or among three skills to learn for making a living. It's all choices, significant choices. Those examples do not suggest direct moral choices, for they are ethically neutral. They can be ethically neutral. They still involve the feeling of responsibility for one's future life. So even neutral choices are not neutral because they all take some kind of responsibility for a future life. Thus, future is not independent from the past. Decision takes place in the present. One chooses in the absolute present. One chooses the future, but not independently of the past. In the future that becomes present, one will think back to an essential choice as to one's significant past. In the television channel Mezzo, for example, contemporary artists have to answer the question about the person who played the most significant role in their becoming musicians. Some of them can answer promptly, others hesitate, or say that they cannot pinpoint at one single person, for there are very few of them, many of them, I don't know. Yet none of the interrogated artists denies that some persons were more influential in capacities, they shaping their artistic inspirations than others. One was most significant than the other. They have developed themselves their own talents. They developed themselves their own talents, their own capacities. This was and is their autonomy, but others inspired them. They learned from them and from their world in general. They were shaped by something outside them, and this means heteronomy. To this point, I avoided to speak of moral choices, like choices between permissible and non-permissible, between obedience to values, persons, or the moral law, and disobedience, between choices between good and evil. At the beginning of the talk, in reference to the Bible, and this I hinted also on Kant, I mentioned his theory. The sequence was done only to two. When I mention Kant, I speak about legality now of morality. In case of legality, Kant speaks about permissible and non-permissible. That is the distinction between moral and non-moral point. The non-moral is permissible, what is non-permissible is already a moral choice. That is, the obedience to the laws of the state is permissible. If you obey the laws of the state, the act is permissible. Everything not prohibited is permissible to choose, as far as legality is concerned. Yet the laws of a republic should not contradict the moral law. They should warrant the permissibility for citizens, not just to choose between permissible and non-permissible, but also obey the moral law. Legality implies the possibility of choice between permitted and non-permitted, yet morality is not about choice, but about the unconditional obedience to the imperative. In case of morality, not legality, where the choice between good and evil is at stake, and in case of morality, according to Kant, there is no choice at all, given that obedience to the moral law is the sole producer of good deeds. But we do not need yet to think of happy philosophical solutions. I suggest to speak first of choices between good and evil as a real choice in real life. Let me presume that choice between good and evil is the most significant choice on the metaphorical crossroad. At such a crossroad, one cannot pull a stick or a piece of paper from a hat. One cannot simply rely on one's intuition. One cannot just bet. One cannot place one's hope all in good luck. And one cannot simply think over rationally the situation of choice. Better to say, these options are not open to all choosers, to some choosers yet, but not all of them. Once upon a time, in homogeneous, smaller communities, good choice equated with choices prescribed and considered as good by the community. Nietzsche termed the situation Sittlichkeit der Sitte. Those times were gone long ago, and the choice between good and evil poses greater difficulties. In Aristotle's world, the difficulties were minor, for he could still enumerate the main virtues of the city and the ways to practice them. The individual, according to Aristotle, had to measure up the situation, the time and the place. He has to make the proper judgment in order to hit the center of the circle, that is the good act. That is, autonomy appeared for Aristotle as the expression of proper application of virtues, generally accepted virtues, in the proper time and the proper place, in the proper way. Needless to say that in our times, where there are not many generally accepted virtues left, moreover, even the generally accepted ones, such as courage, loyalty, are interpreted in entirely different ways. Telling good from evil is a far more complicated task. Loyalty is due, okay, it is due, but to what or to whom? to friends, to causes, to mates, to institutions, to ideas. Loyalty to one of them can imply disloyalty to the other. Courage, yes. But what kind of courage? And courage for what? For throwing bombs on passenger buses? For expressing one's opinion notwithstanding personal consequences? Or boarding a spaceship? Empathy, yes, but with whom? With starving children or with war criminals? And how is empathy expressed? By complaining, protesting, by helping, etc. While asking myself those questions, I attempt the reversal of the question, at least to modify them. Better not ask what is good, rather who is good. Who is a good person? Because irrespective of the definition of goodness, the answer given to this question, who is good, has hardly changed since it has been first asked. Most importantly, both questions and answers refer to situations of choice. Socrates insisted that good is a person who in the situation of choice will rather choose suffering injustice than acting unjustly against the others, will rather suffer ill than harm another person. Or as Kant expressed himself in his book on religion, a person in the situation of choice among different courses of actions should ask himself first whether the action he is about to choose good or evil, or only if it turns out to be good or morally indifferent, then should he raise the question whether it is pleasant, more useful than other options, or bring a greater profit than other options do. To turn back briefly to the crossroad metaphor, although one cannot choose the right track by betting, one can choose it not just by rational considerations, but trying to find out what is good also by impulse. Once Arendt tried to persuade us that evil results from acting unthinkingly. The fact of the matter is, however, that the same can be said about the good. We are born with different genetic equipments, with certain potential talents. There is a kind of goodness beyond decency, presupposing innate inclination to goodness. For example, Mother Teresa certainly had this inclination. The greatest miracle of all happens when someone acts as a good person against her own value system, against her beliefs. One woman tells the following story, quoted by Friedlander in his book on Holocaust. She, now an old lady, was taken to Auschwitz, where she lined up for selection by Mengele. A German girl was standing beside Mengele, taking notes. The moment Mengele looked in another direction, the German girl ran to her and asked her about her age. 13, she answered. No, no, said the German girl. When he will ask you how old you are, you just answer 15. So it happened. Mengele asked her age, she answered 15. You are a lying bastard, said Mengele, pushing her to the other direction, to the other line. Then the German girl again intervened. No, no, she said. Look, she has strong legs, good for working. She must be at least 15. That was the little girl, now an old woman, saved. After telling the story, that's interesting, she added, I don't understand, why did she do it? There is no explanation except the existence of free will. She saved the life of a young Jewish girl. Why? She took notes for Mengele. She could not have been the enemy of Nazism. Why? She was not thinking. She did what she did by impulse. What conclusion can one draw from all these very different cases? Every human choice presupposes autonomy. The individual chooses as a single individual, as an identity. If one chooses looking for the advices, approval, or disapproval of others, the balance between autonomy and heteronomy will be unequal, given that objective identity, the regard of others, weighs heavier than the internal impulse. This, however, does not mean that the deed will be less good, less correct, than in the absence of the regard of the others. For it depends on the morale of the others, of the incarnations of the regard, whether the chosen act will be better or will be worse. Still, the balance between autonomy and heteronomy will shift towards autonomy whenever the actor stands alone at the crossroad, or at least decides to choose as if he stood alone. The deed is normally attributed to the chooser. The act can assume responsibility, and the actor can assume responsibility, and he can also avoid it. Those who avoid responsibility also rewrite their autobiography in a self-defense attempt to change one's history. Rewriting, reinterpreting autobiography involves the manipulation of memory. Due to responsibility avoidance, the choice situation itself will be modified in remembrance. Several flashes of memory pushed onto the unconscious level that is temporarily forgotten. This defense game can be only partially successful. But even if only partially successful, it will influence future choices of the individual at the next crossroad. Subsequent choices are influenced mostly by conscious memory. For every essential choice is also a kind of repetition. Still, the suppressed, more authentic memory is not entirely forgotten. It may reappear as anxiety, as pangs of conscience, and even as a trauma in every new essential choice situation. I told a short story about relative autonomy, present in all our choices to a greater or lesser degree. But what about the well-known dictum by Luther? He writes, "Stand and cannot do otherwise." And what about the famous self-reflective remark by Nietzsche, "I never had a choice"? What about the autonomy of not choosing? Everyone stands before choices, among them essential and unessential ones. There are banal choices, superficial choices, also character-defining choices. The latter are essential because they are character-defining, have long-lasting effects, and cannot be reversed without serious consequences. The most essential choices define a person's whole existence and are termed for this reason existential choices. An existential choice defines a human character and once and for all. If someone says, like Luther or Nietzsche, not having any choices, not making any choices anymore, one restates that one cannot help but tread on a road already chosen once and for all. Surely, people who have no more choices left can still choose. They, like everyone else, stand occasionally before the pragmatic choices. Just in case of all pragmatic choices, the essential, the character-defining existential choice will over-determine all the subsequent choices. In Etica, moral matters, only the expression is new, not the message. Aristotle said that if a man practices himself in all the virtues and passes good judgment in concrete situations, he will finally become a good man who cannot choose but the good in any time, place, relation, circumstance. Kant says more eloquently in his book on religion that moral autonomy requires first the revolution of the mind. Revolution of the mind is a turnaround in the relation of nature and freedom. One decides that transcendental freedom will determine the maxims of all our actions. Till this revolution is just the starting point that must be followed by the reform of our human nature. This will remain unfinished or could be accomplished only in or by infinite progress. To repeat, we have no choice, but let our nature be determined by pure practical reason. We do not know whether we can achieve it, but we at least know what full autonomy really means. Full autonomy is thus both in Aristotle and in Kant identical, the perfect state of a character who has no more choices. Their philosophies, no more moral choices. Their philosophies are entirely different. Though Kant knew well that in the modern world, even to subscribe to commonly accepted virtues means heteronomy, not just because nowadays there are no consensually accepted virtues anymore, for even if consensually accepted virtues existed, something eternal, external, would still define human goodness. And since just such virtues do not exist, thinking through situations and so on would help us in our choices. Heteronomy, says Kant once again. But how can the character-defining, the essential, that is, existential choice, as a fully autonomous choice, be imagined, or rather described? How can I imagine, or even describe it, without falling back to metaphysical speculations about two not interconnected worlds, the world of reason and the world of nature? To raise the question in traditional philosophical terms, how can I make a case for an existential choice, a fully autonomous choice that is both transcendental and empirical, for a choice in the aftermath of which one never has any more a choice? This philosophical answer was sought and found by Kierkegaard's book, first in his book, Either Or. Existential choice, I now quote Kierkegaard, no quote, but I refer to Kierkegaard. Existential choice is not a choice of this or that, of the goal one's life. It is not the choice of an idea, of a profession, not even the choice of the good. Choosing this, rather, means to become a fully autonomous choice, since the chooser chooses himself or herself. But you choose yourself. You are determined by your own choice. This is an existential choice. We choose ourselves. Choosing ourselves is not determined. It is a leap, and as such, not determined at all. Having chosen oneself, one begins to become the one, become to the one we choose ourselves to be. That having chosen oneself means to begin to become somebody, the body, who we are chosen ourselves to be. We do not choose art, but we choose ourselves as artists. And in the wake of our choice, we begin to become an artist. We do not choose the good, but we choose ourselves as good persons and begin to become what we choose ourselves to be, good persons. Having chosen ourselves as this or that, we have no more choices left. By having chosen ourselves, we choose our destiny, that is the destination of our life. We cannot help but fulfill our destination. Full autonomy means to follow our self-chosen self as our destination without fail. Another new essential choice would mean to abandon the road of our self-chosen destiny. A person who abandons his self-chosen destiny becomes an existential failure, and nobody becomes a shipwreck. Thinking of autonomy by an existential choice, one has to ask the question whether it is always a moral choice, whether it means moral autonomy. There is an ethical aspect in all existential choices, but not also a moral one. Sometimes it is difficult to tell one from the other. Luther chose himself as the very person who reformed Christianity. This was his destiny. He could not act otherwise. Nietzsche chose himself a philosopher. This became his destiny. He could not act otherwise. Mostly, what is ethical in the above described sense is not also moral. And sometimes it definitely contradicts morality. Ethics of an existential choice requires to stand by the choice, never betray it, never lie. First of all, never lie to oneself. Just think of Don Giovanni in Mozart's opera. His urge to repent by moral agencies of the world, and he says no 3 times. If he repented, he would become an existential failure. He remains loyal to immorality. Existential choice of ourselves is a moral and not just ethical choice. If one chooses oneself as a good person and begins to become the very good person he chooses himself to be, thus he will become a person who in all cases of concrete choices will rather suffer evil than to do evil, without rumination, out of character, because he will have no other choice. He will be a fully autonomous moral being. But are there such fully autonomous human beings at all? Good persons exist. We all know good persons. All you know good persons. Thinking in philosophical terms, they have chosen themselves as good persons and became what they choose themselves to be. Yet do we know good persons who never fall in their actions, who always and in all situations know immediately what acts are just or unjust? Hardly. But what consequences can we draw from this? The same ones Kant did, when he admitted that we cannot know whether anyone anywhere has acted exclusively by being determined by pure practical reason. Perhaps none. Perhaps none has chosen oneself as a good person without failing to do the right thing in one or in the other situation. Whatever theory we have in mind, we have to admit that none of us is fully autonomous. None of us can choose fully autonomously. Kant would say that full autonomy is a practical, regulative idea. In everyday life, one can just try hard to avoid heteronomy. How? Perhaps first by following Kant's advice that in cases of choices or any kind of action, one better decides whether the choice is good before deciding whether it is pleasant or useful. And second, better to avoid the blind acceptance of public opinion, of ideologies. Third, by trying our best not to lying to ourselves. And finally, being aware of the relativity of our autonomy, of our fragility as accidental human beings. Thank you.